The cast-iron skillet sailed through the dusty air, missing Coltrane Ashworth's massive frame by mere inches before clanging against the barn door. The 6-foot Tate rancher didn't even flinch as his third cook this month stormed off the property, cursing his impossible standards and terrible temper. "Good riddance," he muttered, running calloused fingers through his dark hair. But his stomach growled in protest, reminding him that pride wouldn't fill the aching void that had consumed him since returning from the war 3 years ago. Coltrane had built the largest cattle operation in Willowbrook County with his bare hands, yet he couldn't keep a cook longer than a month. Word had spread through the small Colorado town that working for the giant was like dancing with the devil himself. His ranch hands whispered that something had died inside him during those blood-soaked battlefields, leaving behind a man who trusted no one and smiled even less. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as he saddled his stallion, Ranger, preparing for another futile trip to town. That's when he spotted her walking along the dusty road that led to his property, a woman in a faded blue dress carrying a worn carpet bag, her auburn hair catching the light like burnished copper. Evangeline Clearwater had been walking since dawn, her feet blistered inside her only pair of decent boots. She'd heard about the job from Mrs. Holloway at the general store, who'd whispered that the position paid 3 times the usual wage because no woman could tolerate the man's harsh ways. But Evangeline had endured worse than any cowboy's temper. 6 months after burying her husband, she'd lost their small farm to creditors and had nowhere left to turn. "You lost, ma'am." Coltrane's deep voice rumbled above her as his horse's shadow fell across her path. She looked up, and for a moment both froze. Her eyes were the color of wildflower honey, warm and alive in a way that made something stir in his chest, something he'd thought buried forever. She saw past his intimidating size to the loneliness etched in the lines around his steel-gray eyes. "Like I'm looking for Coltrane Ashworth," she said, tilting her chin up despite having to crane her neck to meet his gaze. "I heard he needs a cook." Coltrane dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the ground with authority. "You heard right? But I should warn you, I've run through 3 cooks this month alone." "And I should warn you," Evangeline replied, a hint of fire dancing in her voice. "I've buried a husband, lost everything I owned, and walked 15 miles in these boots." "I don't scare easily." Something shifted in the air between them, electric and unexpected. Coltrane found himself studying the determined set of her shoulders, the way she stood her ground despite barely reaching his chest. When she smiled, just a small, tentative curve of her lips, it hit him like a physical blow. "Name's Evangeline Clearwater," she said, extending a gloved hand. "Coltrane Ashworth." His massive hand engulfed hers, and he felt the calluses on her palms, evidence of hard work and harder times. "When can I start, Mr. Ashworth?" "Now, if you're willing. But don't say I didn't warn you." As they walked toward the ranch house, neither could have imagined that this moment would change everything. Evangeline's first breakfast nearly started a riot among the ranch hands. The aroma of fresh biscuits, thick-cut bacon, and real coffee, not the bitter chicory they'd grown accustomed to, drew every cowboy within a mile radius to the mess hall like moths to flame. Coltrane entered to find his men practically fighting. Over seconds, their faces lit with the first genuine smiles he'd seen in months. But it wasn't just the food that had them entranced. Evangeline moved through the kitchen with graceful efficiency, humming softly as she worked, bringing life to a space that had felt more like a battlefield than a home. "Ma'am, this here's the finest meal I've had since my mama's cooking," declared Buck Morrison, the grizzled foreman who'd worked the ranch for 15 years. Evangeline's laugh rang out like silver bells, and Coltrane felt something twist in his chest. He grabbed his plate with more force than necessary and retreated to his office, determined to maintain the distance that had kept him safe from feeling anything for so long. But maintaining distance from Evangeline proved impossible. She had a way of appearing wherever he was mending his torn shirt without being asked, leaving fresh coffee on his desk during late-night paperwork sessions, humming those haunting melodies that seemed to seep through the walls of his carefully constructed fortress. 3 weeks into her employment, Coltrane found her in his kitchen past midnight, kneading dough for the next day's bread. Moonlight streamed through the window, casting her in ethereal silver, and he stood transfixed in the doorway. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, without turning around, somehow sensing his presence. "Paperwork," he lied, stepping into the warm circle of lamplight. The truth was, he'd been pacing his room like a caged wolf, thinking about the way she'd smiled at him during dinner, the way her fingers had brushed his when she'd refilled his coffee cup. "I used to bake when I couldn't sleep too," Evangeline said, her voice soft with memory. "After Josiah died, the nights felt endless. Keeping my hands busy helped quiet the thoughts." It was the first time she'd mentioned her late husband, and Coltrane found himself hungry to know more. "How long were you married? 8 years?" "We were childhood sweethearts." She shaped the dough with practiced hands, but he could see the slight tremor in her fingers. "Cancer took him slow and painful. At the end, I was grateful when he found peace." The raw honesty in her voice broke something open inside him. "I'm sorry for your loss." She looked up then, really looked at him, and he felt exposed under her gentle gaze. "What about you, Coltrane? What keeps you pacing the halls at night?" The question hung between them like a challenge. For a moment, he considered retreating behind his usual walls of silence. Instead, he found himself saying ghosts. "From the war?" He nodded, unable to voice the horrors that visited him in dreams. The screams of dying men, the weight of decisions that had cost lives. The moment he'd realized that the boy who'd left for war would never come home. Without a word, Evangeline washed the flour from her hands and moved to the stove, where she began heating milk. "My grandmother used to say that ghosts follow us because we're afraid to let them rest. Maybe if we stop running from them, they'll find peace too." She prepared 2 cups of warm milk sweetened with honey and cinnamon, then sat across from him, at the scarred wooden table, where he'd eaten countless lonely meals. "Tell me about one good memory," she said softly. Before the war, before the pain, and to his amazement, he found himself talking about his mother's garden, about lazy summer afternoons learning to rope cattle, about dreams of building something lasting. As he spoke, Evangeline listened with her whole being, and for the first time in years, the weight on his chest began to lift. When dawn broke over the mountains, they were still talking. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a dust-covered rider who'd pushed his horse hard from Denver. Coltrane signed for it with a growing sense of unease, recognizing the legal firm's seal even before he tore it open. His blood turned to ice as he read. Jeremiah Blackstone, his former business partner who'd cheated him out of half his inheritance, before the war, was claiming ownership of the Eastern Pastures, the heart of Coltrane's cattle operation. The legal documents were thick with whereas clauses and official stamps, but the message was clear. Prove your claim in court within 30 days or lose everything. Evangeline found him an hour later, standing motionless in his office, the papers scattered across his desk like fallen leaves. "Coltrane?" Her voice was soft with concern. "What's happened?" He handed her the letter without a word, watching as her eyes widened with each paragraph. When she finished reading, she set it down gently and moved to stand beside his chair. "We'll fight this," she said with quiet determination. "We." The word escaped before he could stop it. "Did you think I'd abandon you at the first sign of trouble?" Her hand came to rest on his shoulder, and he felt some of the tension leave his body. "Tell me about this Blackstone." The story poured out of him how Jeremiah had been his father's business partner, how he'd manipulated the grieving young Coltrane into signing documents he'd barely understood, how he'd disappeared with half the family fortune while Coltrane was fighting in Virginia. "He's been waiting," Coltrane said bitterly, "waiting for me to build something worth taking." Evangeline was quiet for a long moment, studying the legal papers with the same intensity she brought to everything else. "Claiming they include the water rights to Silver Creek, don't they?" Coltrane nodded. "Without that water, his cattle operation would die within a season." "Then we need to go to Denver," she said simply. "We need to find the original land grants, the ones from before your father's partnership with Blackstone. Evangeline, You don't understand. Blackstone has lawyers, money, influence. I'm just a cowboy who stop. Her voice cut through his despair like a blade. You are not just anything. You built this ranch from nothing after losing everything. You survived a war that broke lesser men. You employ half the county and treat your workers like family. She moved to stand in front of him, forcing him to meet her blazing eyes. And you're not fighting this alone. That afternoon, they rode to town together. Evangeline perched side saddle on his horse while Ranger carried them both with patient strength. The bank manager, Harold Guthrie, was a nervous man who'd known Coltrane's father, and his hands shook as he pulled out the old safety deposit box. Your father was always meticulous about records, Guthrie said, producing a thick bundle of documents. He didn't trust Blackstone, even at the end. Among the papers, Evangeline found what they were looking for, the original territorial land grant, signed by the governor himself, clearly establishing ownership of the disputed territory. But more importantly, she found her late father-in-law's personal journal, filled with detailed accounts of Blackstone's increasingly desperate attempts to gain control of the water rights. Look at this, she breathed, pointing to an entry dated just months before the elder Ashworth's death. He suspected Blackstone was forging documents, trying to establish a false claim. As they prepared for the journey to Denver, the entire ranch mobilized behind them. Buck Morrison insisted on coming along as protection, while the other hands pooled their wages to help fund the legal fight. Even the townspeople, who'd initially been wary of the giant rancher, rallied to support the man who'd quietly helped so many of them through hard times. The night before they left, Evangeline found Coltrane standing by the corral, watching the stars emerge in the vast Colorado sky. Scared? She asked, joining him at the fence. Terrified, he admitted. Not of losing the ranch. I've lost everything before and survived. I'm scared of losing you. She turned to face him fully, her heart hammering against her ribs. What makes you think you'd lose me? Because I'm falling in love with you, Evangeline Clearwater, he said, his voice rough with emotion. And I can't bear the thought that you might be fighting for this place out of obligation rather than... She silenced him by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was gentle but certain, tasting of hope and honey and the promise of tomorrow. Rather than love? She whispered against his mouth. Oh, you impossible man. I fell in love with you the first night we talked until dawn. Denver's courthouse loomed like a brick-and-mortar fortress, its imposing columns designed to intimidate those seeking justice. Evangeline smoothed her best dress, a deep green wool that brought out her eyes, and took Coltrane's offered arm as they climbed the marble steps. Behind them, Buck Morrison and their hired lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Victoria Sterling, who'd agreed to take their case after reviewing the evidence, followed with grim determination. Inside the courtroom, Jeremiah Blackstone sat at the plaintiff's table like a king holding court. At 60, he'd grown soft around the middle, his once golden hair now silver and perfectly groomed. His suit probably cost more than most folks in Willowbrook County made in a year, and his smile held the cold calculation of a snake sizing up its prey. Coltrane Ashworth, Blackstone's voice carried across the room as they entered. My, how you've grown. Still playing in the dirt? I see. Coltrane's jaw tightened, but Evangeline's gentle pressure on his arm kept him moving forward. She could feel the tension radiating from his massive frame and sent up a silent prayer that their evidence would be enough. Judge Harrison Fitzgerald was a weathered man in his 70s who'd seen every kind of land dispute the territory had to offer. His reputation for fairness was legendary. But Evangeline noticed how his eyes lingered on Blackstone's expensive legal team. 3 lawyers from the most prestigious firm in Colorado. The proceedings began with Blackstone's lead attorney, a silver-tongued devil named Cornelius Wade, presenting what appeared to be an airtight case. He produced documents showing a partnership agreement between the elder Ashworth and Blackstone, along with what he claimed were properly executed land transfers giving his client rights to the disputed territory. My client invested heavily in the development of these lands, Wade declared, his voice filling the courtroom. For 20 years, He's waited patiently for young Mr. Ashworth to honor his father's debts. Now he simply seeks what is rightfully his. When Victoria Sterling rose to present their defense, the atmosphere in the room shifted. She was younger than Wade, but she moved with the precision of a seasoned warrior. Methodically, she laid out their evidence, the original land grants, the detailed journal entries, and most damaging of all, a letter from the elder Ashworth to his banker expressing concern about forged documents. "Your Honor," Sterling said, holding up the crucial letter, "this correspondence, dated just 3 months before Daniel Ashworth's death, clearly states his suspicion that Mr. Blackstone was attempting to fraudulently alter their partnership agreement." Confident's smile faltered for the first time, but the real blow came when Evangeline took the witness stand. With quiet authority, she walked the court through her analysis of the handwriting on the disputed documents, pointing out inconsistencies that suggested forgery. Her background as a schoolteacher had made her expert at detecting when students altered their work, and those skills served her well now. "If you examine the formation of the letter G in Mr. Blackstone's alleged signature," she explained, using a magnifying glass to highlight the differences, "you'll notice that it varies significantly from his verified signatures on the original partnership documents. The pressure, the angle, even the ink flow suggest these signatures were added later, possibly traced from authentic examples." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as even Blackstone's lawyers leaned forward to examine the evidence more closely. During cross-examination, Wade attempted to discredit Evangeline's testimony by questioning her qualifications. "Mrs. Clearwater, you're not a handwriting expert, are you? Just a schoolteacher from a small town." Evangeline's spine straightened. "I am a widow who lost everything to men who thought they could take advantage of someone they saw as weak and ignorant. I've learned to examine evidence very carefully, Mr. Wade, and the evidence shows that your client is a fraud." The gallery erupted and scattered applause before Judge Fitzgerald's gavel restored order. The final surprise came when Buck Morrison took the stand. The grizzled foreman testified that he'd worked for the elder Ashworth and had personally witnessed several heated arguments between the partners in the months before Daniel's death. Mr. Blackstone kept pushing for more control, Buck said, his weathered hands steady as he pointed directly at the defendant. Said the boy was too young to inherit such a large operation. Mr. Daniel, he saw right through it. Told me he was planning to buy out Blackstone's share entirely. As the day wore on, Blackstone's case crumbled piece by piece. His lawyers requested multiple recesses, each time returning with increasingly desperate arguments. By late afternoon, even the judge seemed convinced, but Blackstone had one final card to play. "Your Honor," he said, rising suddenly from his chair, "I withdraw my claim to the land in question. However, I believe Mr. Ashworth owes me compensation for my years of partnership with his father. I'm willing to settle for, let's say, $50,000. The sum was staggering, more than most ranchers saw in a lifetime. Evangeline felt Coltrane stiffen beside her, knowing he didn't have that kind of money, and likely never would. "Judge." Fitzgerald looked from Blackstone to Coltrane, his expression unreadable. "I'll hear final arguments tomorrow morning. Court is adjourned." As they filed out of the courthouse, Evangeline squeezed Coltrane's hand. The battle wasn't over yet. That evening, in their modest Denver hotel room, Coltrane sat slumped in a chair by the window, staring out at the gaslit streets below. Even victory felt hollow when it came with a price tag that could destroy everything he'd built. $50,000, he said bitterly. This might as well be 50 million. Evangeline sat on the bed behind him, her mind racing through possibilities. There has to be another way. Blackstone wouldn't have made that offer unless he was desperate. "Cornered, so he's going for the killing blow," Coltrane replied. "Even if the judge rules in our favor on the land dispute, he can still claim damages for the dissolved partnership. 50,000. He shook his head. "I'd have to sell everything, and it still wouldn't be enough." Victoria Sterling knocked on their door near midnight, her usually perfect hair disheveled, and her eyes bright with exhaustion and discovery. "I've been going through the courthouse records," she said, spreading papers across the small table, "looking for any other cases involving Blackstone, any pattern of behavior that might help us." What she'd found was better than gold. 3 separate lawsuits over the past decade, all following the same pattern: Blackstone would enter into partnerships with older ranchers or farmers, then claim ownership after their deaths, presenting documents that their surviving families swore were fraudulent. In each case, Sterling explained, he eventually settled out of court for substantial sums rather than face a full investigation. But look at this. In the Morrison case from 1878, his alleged partner's signature was witnessed by the same notary who supposedly witnessed your father's documents. Evangeline leaned forward, studying the papers. The same notary who died in a house fire 6 months before my father-in-law's death? Exactly. Sterling's smile was sharp as a blade. Jeremiah Blackstone has been forging documents for years, using a dead man's seal to make them appear legitimate. The next morning, they returned to court armed with new evidence and renewed hope. But Blackstone was waiting with his own surprise. A newspaper reporter from the Denver Post and a photographer, clearly arranged to document what he expected to be Coltrane's public humiliation. Judge Fitzgerald listened intently as Sterling presented the evidence of Blackstone's pattern of fraud. Courthouse was packed now, word having spread through Denver about the dramatic case, and Evangeline could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon them. Mr. Blackstone, the judge said finally, voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench, these are serious allegations. How do you respond to evidence that you've been using a deceased notary's seal to authenticate forged documents? The first time, Blackstone's composure cracked entirely. His face went white, then red as he conferred frantically with his lawyers. The whispered conference stretched for several minutes before Wade stood with obvious reluctance. Your Honor, my client wishes to withdraw all claims and settle this matter privately. I'm afraid that's no longer possible, Judge Fitzgerald replied coldly. These documents suggest criminal fraud on a scale that demands investigation. Bailiff, please place Mr. Blackstone under arrest pending a full inquiry. In chaos, as Blackstone was led away in shackles, still protesting his innocence, the photographer's flashbulbs popped frantically, capturing every moment of his downfall. But the real celebration began when they returned to Willowbrook County 3 days later. The entire town had turned out to welcome them home with a banner stretched across Main Street reading "Justice for the Ashworth Ranch." Even the normally reserved bank manager, Harold Guthrie, was seen wiping tears from his eyes as the buckboard carrying Coltrane and Evangeline rolled down the dusty street. That evening, as the victory party in the town square wound down, Coltrane found himself alone with Evangeline on the porch of his ranch house. Their ranch house, he corrected himself. The legal battle had changed something fundamental between them, binding them together in ways that went deeper than mere attraction. I have something to ask you, he said, his voice suddenly uncertain, despite everything they'd been through together. Evangeline turned from watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink, found him on one knee beside her chair, holding a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. I know we've done everything backwards, he said, his gray eyes intense with emotion. Falling in love, fighting battles together, building a life before? But Evangeline Clearwater would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because you feel obligated, not because of what we've been through, but because she silenced him with a kiss that tasted of joy and tears and promises kept. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, she whispered against his lips, "Yes, you impossible, wonderful man. Yes to everything." As if summoned by their joy, the ranch hands began appearing from barns and bunkhouses. Buck Morrison leading the charge with a bottle of his carefully hoarded whiskey and a grin that split his weathered face from ear to ear. "About time, boss," he declared, raising the bottle in salute. "About damned time." The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the little white church that anchored Willowbrook County's main street. Evangeline had initially wanted something simple, just the two of them and a minister. But the entire community had other ideas. By the time the great day arrived, it had become the social event of the decade. With families traveling from 3 counties to witness the union of the giant rancher and the brave widow who'd tamed his heart. Evangeline walked down the aisle, wearing her mother's ivory silk dress, carefully altered to fit her smaller frame. Her auburn hair crowned with wildflowers picked fresh that morning by the ranchers' wives. but it was her radiant smile that took every breath away, especially Coltrane's, who stood at the altar, looking magnificent in his best black suit, his usually stern features soft with wonder. The ceremony was conducted by Reverend Marcus Webb, who'd baptized Coltrane as a baby and had watched him grow from a carefree boy into a hardened man and finally into someone capable of love again. His voice carried clearly through the packed church as he spoke of second chances and the courage it takes to open one's heart after loss. Love, the Reverend said, looking directly at the couple before him, is not just feeling, it's choosing. To stand together when the world tries to tear you apart, seeing the best in each other when everyone else sees only flaws. Coltrane and Evangeline have already proven their love in the crucible of adversity. Today, they simply make it official in the eyes of God and this community. When Coltrane slipped the simple gold band onto Evangeline's finger, his hands were steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Her own hands trembled slightly as she placed a matching band on his finger, the first jewelry he'd worn since removing his father's signet ring years ago. "You may kiss your bride, Reverend Webb," declared with a smile. The kiss was gentle, reverent, full of promises for the future they would build together. But it was the spontaneous cheer that erupted from the congregation that truly sealed the moment in memory. Cowboys whooping, ladies dabbing at their eyes with lace handkerchiefs, and children clapping with delight. The reception was held in the church hall, transformed for the occasion with garlands of autumn leaves and mason jars filled with the last wildflowers of the season. Long tables groaned under the weight of dishes contributed by every family in attendance, roasted beef from the Ashworth Ranch, fresh bread, preserves, pies, and cakes that would be talked about for years to come. Buck Morrison served as unofficial master of ceremonies, regaling the crowd with carefully edited stories of Coltrane's courtship. "Now, I ain't saying our boss was obvious about his feelings," he drawled, earning chuckles from the ranch hands, "but the man once walked into a fence post while watching Miss Evangeline hang laundry. Even Coltrane laughed at that, his arm tightening around his new wife's waist as she blushed prettily beside him. As the evening wore on and the fiddles began to play, Coltrane led Evangeline onto the makeshift dance floor for their first dance. As husband and wife, he moved with surprising grace for such a large man, guiding her through the steps, while the crowd watched with fond approval. "Any regrets?" murmured in her ear as they swayed together. "Only that we waited so long," she replied, then pulled back to look into his eyes. "I love you, Coltrane Ashworth. All of you, the gentleness and the strength, the laughter and the scars. And I love you, Mrs. Ashworth," he said, the name rolling off his tongue like a prayer. "More than I ever thought possible." The celebration continued well into the night, but eventually the newlyweds slipped away to begin their honeymoon in a small cabin Coltrane had built beside Silver Creek. He'd spent weeks preparing it in secret, installing glass windows to catch the morning light and filling it with wildflowers and books he'd ordered specially from Denver. Their first morning as husband and wife dawned crisp and clear, with frost painting the meadow grass silver and the creek singing its eternal song. Evangeline woke first, marveling at the sight of her giant husband sleeping peacefully beside her. His face relaxed in a way she'd never seen during their courtship. She slipped from the bed quietly and padded to the kitchen to start coffee, humming the same melody that had first caught his attention months ago. When Coltrane woke to the aroma of fresh biscuits and the sound of her voice, he knew he'd found something more precious than gold. He'd found home. "Good morning, husband," Evangeline said, turning from the stove with a smile that could have powered the sun. "Good morning, wife," he replied, pulling her into his arms for a kiss that tasted of coffee and contentment and all the mornings yet to come. Outside, Silver Creek chuckled over its stones, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang of new beginnings. 2 years later, Evangeline stood in the kitchen of their expanded ranch house, one hand resting on her rounded belly while the other stirred a pot of stew. That would feed the dozen extra hands they'd hired for the fall roundup. The Ashworth Ranch had grown beyond anyone's dreams, but more importantly, it had become a true home filled with laughter, love, and the promise of future generations. Mama Evie. 4-year-old Timothy Clearwater, her late husband's nephew, whom they'd taken in after his parents died in a flu epidemic, burst through the door with dirt-streaked cheeks and eyes bright with excitement. "Papa Coltrane says the new foals are ready to see people." Evangeline smiled at the title the boy had bestowed upon her husband. Coltrane had initially been terrified of the responsibility of raising a child, but Timothy had wrapped the giant around his little finger within days of arriving at the ranch. Now, watching them together, Coltrane patiently teaching Timothy to rope or reading bedtime stories in his deep, gentle voice, filled her heart to overflowing. "Let me finish this stew, and then we'll go see the babies," she promised, ruffling Timothy's dark hair. The past 2 years had brought changes beyond their wildest imagination. The ranch now employed 30 hands and ran 3,000 head of cattle across expanded pastures. They'd built a proper schoolhouse where Evangeline taught the children of their workers and neighboring families. And Coltrane had established a lending program to help young couples start their own small ranches. But the most significant change was in Coltrane himself. The grim, solitary man who'd hired her to cook had become a pillar of the community, serving on the town council, organizing relief efforts for struggling families, and earning a reputation for fairness and generosity that stretched across 3 counties. "There's my beautiful wife," Coltrane's voice rumbled from the doorway as he entered, automatically ducking slightly under the frame.
Ow.
Even after all this time, the sight of him made her heart flutter. At 35, he'd grown even more handsome, his face softened by happiness and his eyes bright with the kind of peace that comes from finding one's true purpose. He crossed to her in 3 long strides, his massive hands gentle as they settled on her waist. "How are you feeling today?" "Like I'm carrying a future cattle baron," she replied, leaning into his warmth. At 6 months pregnant, she was finally beginning to show. And Coltrane had become comically protective, insisting she rest constantly and hiring additional help for the household. "Or a daughter who'll wrap her daddy around her finger just like her mama did," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. Their peaceful moment was interrupted by Buck Morrison's arrival. His weathered face creased with the kind of grin that usually meant either very good news or very interesting trouble. "Boss, you're gonna want to see this," he announced, waving a letter. Came in on the afternoon stage. Coltrane opened the official-looking envelope and read in silence, his expression growing more amazed with each line. Finally, he looked up at Evangeline with wonder in his eyes. "The governor wants to appoint me Territorial Livestock Commissioner," he said, sinking into a chair as if his legs had suddenly given out. "It would mean representing all the ranchers in Colorado Territory, working with the railroad companies, even traveling to Washington to meet with federal officials." Evangeline felt a moment of panic at the thought of him traveling so far from home. But then she saw the spark of excitement he was trying to hide, and knew this was exactly the kind of challenge he needed. "When would you start?" she asked. "That's just it. The position doesn't begin until after the territory gains statehood, which could be next year or the year after. And it would be based here in Colorado, with only occasional trips to the Capita." He reached for her hands, his gray eyes intense. "Evangeline, this could change everything. Not just for us, but for every rancher trying to make an honest living in this territory." "Then you have to accept," she said simply. That evening, after Timothy had been tucked into bed with his favorite story about a brave cowboy and his magical horse, Coltrane and Evangeline sat on their porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the vast Colorado sky. The same stars that had witnessed their first tentative conversations, their courtship, their struggles, and now their triumphs. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Coltrane asked, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "If you hadn't walked down that dusty road looking for work?" "Every day," Evangeline admitted. "But then I remember that some things are meant to be. You needed someone to feed more than just your body, and I needed someone to remind me that life after loss is still worth living." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. In the distance, they could see lights in the bunkhouse, where their hands were probably playing cards and sharing stories, and in the little cabin they'd built for Buck, who'd become like family to them both. "I love you, Evangeline Ashworth," Coltrane said, the words carrying the weight of everything they'd built together. "And I love you, Commissioner Ashworth," she replied with a smile in her voice. He chuckled and pulled her closer, his hand coming to rest on their unborn child. "Think our son or daughter will want to be a rancher?" "I think our child will want to change the world," Evangeline said confidently, "just like their parents." As if in response to her words, the baby kicked strongly, making them both laugh. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, blessing a love that had grown from the hardest soil into something as enduring as the mountains themselves. In the kitchen, a pot of stew cooled on the stove, filling the house with the aroma of home. And somewhere in the pasture, a meadow lark sang of tomorrow's promises, its song carrying across the land that love had claimed and made their own.